Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Zoom event of Kurd-Akad. The title of today's event is 100 Years of the Treaty of Lausanne, Historical Legacy, Political Continuities, and Future Perspectives. Today's event is jointly organized by Kurd-Akad Germany. One second, I'm sorry, I was hearing myself. Yeah, today's event is jointly organized by Kurd-Akad Germany, Kurd-Akad UK, and Switzerland. And I would like to express my special thank you to Dr. Dersim Dadeviren, who puts a lot of effort into organizing this event. We will start by hearing talks from our distinguished speakers, Professor Nilay, Özok-Gündogan, and Dr. Hisyar Özsoy. Afterwards, we will have a question and answer session. The questions can be written in the Zoom chat or asked in person. Our first speaker is Professor Nilay Özok-Gündogan. She is a professor at Florida State University, and her research focuses on modern state making, elite formation, property regimes, and intercommunal conflict and coexistence in Ottoman Kurdistan. Her work stands at the junction of Ottoman, Kurdish, Armenian, and Turkish histories. She also writes about the question of methodology in Kurdish studies. Professor Nilay, the floor is yours. Please, you can start.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks for this generous introduction. Yes, my research specialty is Kurdistan in the long 19th and 20th centuries. And somehow the circumstances forced me to focus on more political history because it is the centenary of the important Lausanne Treaty. But in normal circumstances, when political conflicts and situations don't force us, I focus more on the social history of Kurds and Kurdistan, issues related to property ownership, elites, lower classes, and things like that. But I have been thinking and writing about Lausanne recently because of its significance. And I'm not going to speak for a lot of time. I will just highlight a few important things about the treaty and its general history and why it is important for Kurds. Why is it also important for Kurdistan as a territory and for its future, like you said, like introduced for its prospects. So Lausanne Treaty, it marked the end of World War I. So there are like different ways in which we can approach this treaty. We can see it as the end of an ongoing process, end of a story, and the beginning of a long story, another story, or we can see it in a continuum from World War I and the processes leading up to the end of the war and the establishment of a modern state system in the Middle East. But as far as the treaty itself is concerned, it officially settled the conflicts between the Ottoman Empire and the Allied forces. And most of the time, when you look at the history books, of course, the history of Lausanne is narrated by situating Turkey at its center. And there is a fair reason for that, because Lausanne gave Turkey official legitimacy and recognition in the international arena, and it demarcated its boundaries. So Turkey really gained political legitimacy it gained its territorial divisions and also its economic independence. But this concerns the history of Turkey and its like modern history of Turkey. But if we just change the story and situate Kurds and Kurdistan at the center of this historical narrative, then we start seeing different things, right? And what we see as like the beginning of Turkish history is kind of like it indicates a big transformation in terms of the history of Kurds and Kurdistan, because it officially means the end of recognition or end of any prospect for Kurdish recognition and Kurdish sovereignty in this new context, in which modern state making was happening in the Middle East. So, and also there are other things like, yes, the treaty gave Turkey economic independence because it regulated the Ottoman debts, the long, lived problem of capitulations. But if you again approach it from the perspective of Kurds and Kurdistan, it means the territorial division of Kurdistan and the economic colonization of Kurdistan by these new nation states emerging in the early 20th century. So, but another aspect of the treaty which makes it really significant for Kurdistan is the minorities, right? I'm sure like we will talk about all of these things in more detail. But one of the things that make the treaty really important for Kurds is that Kurds did not receive a minority definition, an official minority definition in this time period with Lausanne. And definition of minorities for a lot of political, historical, contextual reasons were limited to non-Muslim minorities of this new modern state of Turkey with Lausanne, which means that significant aspects of Kurdish life, including like law, including language, right, including property, all of these things remained outside of the regulations of international community and left at the mercy of the Turkish state. And I'm sure like my colleague Hisyar Özsoy can tell us a little bit more about the contemporary ramifications of this process. Another issue that came up during the Lausanne conference and then in its aftermath after the signature was, of course, the Mosul. Mosul was important for a lot of parties, for Kurds, for the British, for Turkey, or the new emerging modern Turkish state. But Mosul also was important for oil. And so the resolution about Mosul had to wait. It was postponed, so Lausanne did not give Mosul either to Turkey or to Kurds or anybody else. So it had to wait for a couple of more years to reach to a resolution. So this is in a nutshell why Lausanne is important for Kurds, right? For economic reasons, for political reasons, in terms of minority, in terms of territorialization, but most importantly, political recognition, right? Political recognition was something that Kurds were longing for from the early 20th century until the signing of the treaty in 1924. But that prospect, that political agenda came to an end, and a new beginning, right? A new beginning with new types of Kurdish mobilization came in the aftermath of 1924. And it can't be a coincidence that in 1925, we see a large-scale Kurdish uprising with demands for an independent Kurdistan with the Sheikh Zayed rebellion. So 1924, the processes leading up to 1924 with Lausanne, it is really important for the modern history of Kurds. But I'm an historian, like you mentioned. I mean, we can talk a lot about issues related to political history of Kurds in the context leading up to Lausanne. Questions like, why did the Kurds never receive representation during Lausanne conference? Or what was their expectation from the Lausanne conference? What did Lausanne do to their larger political agenda in terms of autonomy, in terms of independence? These are all really fair questions that historians now starting to think in more detail. But before we talk about these things, I want to talk about our larger historical perspective here, because there is like facts, historical developments, but what comes as an historical narrative is shaped by how we read our sources and also political processes, contemporary political discourses shape our understanding of the past, our understanding of history. And when you read accounts written by like Kurds and others in terms of how Kurdish elites acted during the processes leading up to the Lausanne Treaty, you see a narrative of catastrophe, right? Like the historical perspective mostly talk about Kurdish elites as, well, they were the pawns, right? They were in Turkish, they were the kuklas of the great forces. And another narrative, another aspect of this historical narrative is failure, right? This was a big failure. This was a big failure for Kurdish elites. And another very dominant narrative concerns an argument saying that Kurds were divided, Kurdish elites were divided. There was a lot of inter-elite conflict between the Kurdish elites. And so the great powers, they never found legitimate representation coming from the Kurds, so they did not take them seriously. And another aspect of this problematic, historical narrative is about the ordinary people, Kurds, mostly narrated as like, well, they did not give their support to the Kurdish elites. Kurdish elites they were not able to receive the legitimacy of the larger segments of the society. So as you see, when we think of the Lausanne context, but not just the Lausanne context, but this significant time period for Kurds and Kurdistan from the early 20th century until the 1920s, us, even Kurds and those who are actually sympathetic to contemporary Kurdish cause, also kind of reproduce these colonial vision when it comes to our understanding of the Kurdish elites. And at times we describe the Kurdish elites as collaborators. We say that, oh, they collaborated with the Turkish state, or we just say that, well, they just didn't have any political agency. So where I start this process of understanding the significant time period for the Kurds is by changing this perspective, right? Changing this perspective and trying to understand what was the larger historical context in which the Kurdish elites were operating. What were their historical options? What were the political choices that they had in front of them? What type of agendas, what type of strategies did they really develop, notwithstanding the difficulties they faced in the international arena, locally, regionally, and at the imperial level? So, like I said, the first thing that I think we can do, since it's the centenary of the Lausanne Treaty, is to turn upside down how we think about Kurdish history in general and Kurdish political elites and then their activism from 1914 all the way until the 1920s. And so I can just keep going about the details of what I mean by this, because there is, for instance, an important question of, well, why did the Kurdish elites support the Turkish nationalist movement at some point, especially from around late 1919 and mostly 1920? And why did they not demand any sort of representation at the Lausanne conference? So these are all questions that we need to really carefully investigate to understand, to have a fair notion of Kurdish history and the history of the Kurdish elites during this significant time period. But there are recent works, since it is the centenary of the Lausanne Treaty, historians look more closely into different aspects of this treaty and the conference. For instance, one recent work by Hans-Lukas Kieser attributes a very formative role to the Lausanne Treaty. And what he emphasizes here is not just the institutional aspects or the territorial aspects of the treaty, but he talks about Lausanne Treaty as the most important turning point leading up to the establishment of the racialized regimes in the Middle East. Racialized in the sense that certain groups were rendered devoid of their basic human rights, linguistic rights, legal and civic rights, and Kurds can be the best example in this case. But not just that, establishment of these racialized and in a couple of years, fascist regimes in Europe and in the larger Middle East, or fascist-oriented regimes, he sees this as an important turning point. So for us, for Kurds, a community and a nation that lost their prospect of statehood with Lausanne and who were exposed to deep assimilation policies, demographic engineering policies in their early Republican era, I think we can take Hisyar's point quite seriously to understand how the new Turkish state approached the Kurds and how the international community actually led the way for this and gave legitimacy to an authoritarian Turkish state that rendered Kurds, devoid of their major human rights, linguistic rights, and recognition in the new Turkish state.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Like
Thank
I
you.
said, I would be happy to elaborate on these points in the QA section.
Okay, thank you very much. The QA session will be after the two talks. So our next speaker is Dr. Hisyar Özsoy. He is a former MP for the People's Democratic Party, HDP. Dr. Hisyar Özsoy earned his PhD in political anthropology in 2010 at the University of Texas, and from 2011 onwards he lectured at the University of Michigan. Dr. Hisyar Özsoy was chosen as a lecturer in the Thompson Center for Learning and Teaching of the University of Michigan. Dr. Özsoy, the mic is yours.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you, dear Ahmed. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Lovely to be with you today. Important day, July 24th, 100th anniversary of the Lausanne Treaty, which is typically called a peace treaty, in the sense that it ended the war between the warring parties in the First World War, right? That is the very last one, actually, the Lausanne Treaty. It somehow finalized the war between those warring parties. But I totally agree with Nilay in the sense that we need a really different conceptualization, a reconceptualization here, and I would not call it a peace treaty. I mean, it might have ended the war itself between, the Allies and the new Turkish Republic, or the old Ottoman Empire, whatever, however you word it. But it did not create peace for a lot of people. And of course, the Kurds, so they were talking about the Kurds mostly, but rather than viewing the Lausanne Treaty as a peace treaty, I think one can take it as a kind of a treaty that displaced war, conflict, and violence. It's a displacement. Yes, the conflict and war between those countries, Britain, France, whatever, Italy, and Greece, and with Turkey, that war ended. But war, violence, and conflict got displaced within Turkey, I should say, and Iraq and Syria later. So from since the end of the Ottoman Empire, the declaration of the Turkish Republic, a lot of communities, formerly subjects of the Ottoman Empire, they have been having all kinds of violence, experiencing violence and conflict, and sometimes at the level of genocide. And so still we call, this process a peace process. You see, the notion of peace is, I think, very problematic here. And even if it is not a misnomer in the sense that yes, it partly ended the war, the fight between, those countries and Turkey, but it is a great mystification, as if, peace started. No, for the Turkish Republic, it may be peace with the others, but for a lot of people living under the territories now called the Turkish Republic, the war has just started, actually, conflict and violence. And Nilay mentioned already 1925, the Shersad rebellion in Agra, Ararat, in Dersim, and still it's going on now, actually. We are still in the middle of the last rebellion since the late 70s, early 80s, so it's going on. And just yesterday, the day before, there were like thousands, tens of thousands of people who were in Lausanne actually protesting the fact that Lausanne did not give Kurds any kind of legal recognition in the international order. Still, the root cause of many problems that the Kurds and a lot of other so-called minorities are experiencing. So this is number one, I should say. Let's not call it a peace treaty or use the word peace in a very narrow and limited and specific sense, like by putting an end to the war between Turkey and other forces. And let's track the displacement of war, violence, and conflict for many other people. It's just a beginning. This peace treaty is the beginning of multiple wars to come that have destroyed Kurds and Kurdistan and many other peoples, not just Kurds and Kurdistan. So the second point I would like to raise is with the Lausanne Treaty, which organized, I would say, a couple of questions. When Lausanne, of course, at the very formal level, is the international recognition of the Turkish Republic, which recognized its territorial boundaries, its sovereignty, political sovereignty, and its economic independence. At least that is the story, the narrative, historical narrative told to us, the dominant one. And relations of economy and identity and sovereignty and land, all of these are somehow organized within the political form that we call the nation state, right? Because the international order is based on the nation states, whether they recognize a country, right, or they just refuse to recognize. Say, for example, what is happening to the Turkish Republic of Cyprus, right, which was declared in 1974, but so far nobody has recognized it internationally. So internationally, it doesn't exist. Nobody has established any relations with them except for Turkey, and simply it doesn't exist in the international legal terms. So recognizing Turkey as a sovereign entity, that is what it did. But it just didn't do that. That is the first step. And this is being taken as a success by a lot of Turkish elites, of course. So this is when the world recognized Turkey as an independent sovereign state. Yes, but at the same time, those people who were not recognized in this document, the Kurds and many others, not just the Kurds, but the Kurds being probably the biggest population there at the time, and so seeking some kind of recognition. And so all of these people, they became problems to be dealt with domestically. So the questions of Kurds and Kurdistan, which are regional problems there in the Middle East, and that need to be, and these are the Kurds and Kurdistan are big issues, phenomena that complicate relations of territory, of identity, of sovereignty, of economy in the Middle East, in the center of the Middle East. what's called the Middle East. At the time, actually, they were not calling it the Middle East, but that geography. And now the Kurds are not just divided. Yes, they are divided, their land, and as a people, they are divided. And not just they are being incorporated into new nation state formations as margins, which is happening, right? They became the margins of like these nation states. But fundamentally, they became domestic security issues. Why I emphasize this, I mean, that domestic security issue, the word domestic means that the international order will not interfere into domestic matters. And that is the whole point, right? The whole point of the international order is once you recognize internationally the sovereignty of a nation, and then you do not interfere into their domestic matters. I mean, it's almost a cliche. And whatever happened to the Kurds after 1923, in 1925, in 1930s, in 38, and still, but it's mostly the Kurdish issue, which is by definition a regional issue, a historical issue, a big issue. It became translated into this so-called domestic issue that Turkey needs to deal with. Hence, the Kurds are bandits, they are Shaki, they are Ashkia, they are terrorists, they are anarchists, but never proper political subjects seeking recognition from Turkey or the international order. I think that is a very crucial issue, that the kind of so-called domestication of the Kurdish issue, which is another mystification. Third, which is very, I think, still important. I mean, it's not just this Lausanne Treaty just divided the Kurds and Kurdistan as land and a people, but they have, this treaty has planted the seeds of future strife and conflict within the Kurdish people. Like, I mean, it impacted intra-Kurdish relations within the Kurdish community. I mean, if now, after 100 years, the Kurds still cannot come together and develop some sense of national unity when it is most needed, I mean, we need to go and see the roots of, I mean, these divisions, contemporary divisions in these historical divisions, because what happened was that the Kurds were incorporated into Arab and Turkish political formations, and the boundaries created there, the borders, all those mines and barbed wire and whatever, like destruction, disconnection of those, ties. And of course, they developed their own historical movements, political movements, and today they are continuing their resistance in Iran, in Iraq, and in Turkey. Iran is a separate issue, of course. Historically, I mean, it's the division, its separation from the broader Kurdistan is much earlier. But still, I mean, those developments in the early 20th century are still shadowing the efforts to bring Kurds together, at least to have some degree of minimum degree of national unity to fight multiple perils against Kurds and Kurdistan. Yeah, so that is number 3, intra-Kurdish relations. I think one other very big important is that not only this historical process has complicated intra-Kurdish relations, it also undermined the possibility of peaceful coexistence among former subjects of the Ottoman Empire. Like, I want to push a bit further my argument that the Lausanne Peace Treaty is not a peace treaty, or it is peace in a very limited sense, but it created a lot of wars and conflicts and violence. So this is part of the argument. And at the same time, it undermined the possibility of a peaceful coexistence among these peoples, Kurds, Turks, Arabs, and Armenians, Chaldeans, Syriacs, and Nestorians. I mean, so many people were there. But once the Turkish elite has kind of received international recognition for an ethnicized form of nation state, a very ethnic and racialized Turkish nation state, and that has depleted any opportunity for these peoples to somehow find a way to coexist. I'm not talking about a romantic, harmonious, peaceful, fully coexistence of these people, but this was another very, very major step to establish the hegemony of Turkish peoples in the Middle East over others. The Armenians were already genocided. The treaty couldn't even protect the rights of remaining Armenians. The Greek will be dealt with population exchanges, which is another, demographic engineering, which happened. And the Kurds will be destroyed at any cost. So these are the three big populations there, right? The Kurds and the Greek and the Armenians. And the Lausanne Treaty, while the Armenians were dealt with before, unfortunately, I'm using that dealt with in quotation marks, in the late 19th century and during the war, 1915. And then now the Greek are somehow exchanged, and then the Kurds will be killed so that you can have a homogeneous, internally homogeneous, territory where you can actually consolidate the Turkish, not Turkish, a Turkish political formation there. And so since then, it has been 100 years. The people in Iraq and in Syria and in Turkey now, see, they don't have peace. They don't. We still kill each other as peoples, not because we are nasty, bad people and don't know how to have a rational dialogue or, talk out our problems, work out our differences and coexist peacefully. It's not about that. This is history, actually. This history of destruction that has complicated inter-community relations in the Middle East so much that unfortunately we don't have the space even to negotiate our fundamental differences. So it is big. The Kurds are in quotation marks a problem in Syria. See, now the Kurds are now even impacting the NATO processes, the Swedish membership to the NATO, Turkish attacks and Turkish-Russian relations, and Kurds in Iraq too. They are mediating the relations between Arabs and the United States and the West, and the Kurds in Turkey, of course. Turkish relations with Europe and many other countries. So they are there. But conflicts are there, problems are there, and in that sense, I also agree with Nilay in the sense that she mentioned an argument by another academic that the Lausanne Treaty is not just really about the Kurds. It's kind of became the master narrative, I would say. Everybody is following the Lausanne, and it became kind of the Western kind of organization, state of how to say, the Western order of things in the Middle East, and then that is how relations of sovereignty and identity and land, they were organized and governed since then, not just in Kurdistan, but in the Middle East, maybe, if not all of the so-called Middle East, but at least in Iraq and in Syria and in Turkey. So it's not just about Turkey, it's about these places as well. So Nilay already mentioned, I won't go into details of that, the Kurds, of course, we do not have any kind of legal status. And 100 years later, we are seeking some kind of an internationally recognized legal status, which means we simply don't exist. As a people, biologically, of course, physically, we exist, but at the level of the international legal order, we just don't exist. That is why whatever happens to us is not internationally recognized. You may have a genocide, it is not recognized. There may be crackdowns, all kinds of repression, violence, and ultimately all of this get kind of wrapped into the notion of some certain domestic matters or security matters. And then simply we do not exist. So I think like what happened 100 years ago is actually the root cause of what we are having right now. And not just as Kurds, but as I said, like many other peoples who couldn't get any kind of recognition from the international order in terms of their demands for territory, for identity, for sovereignty, for independence or autonomy. Nobody could get it except Turks. And finally, I mean, when we talk about the situation of the Kurds, we say the Kurds couldn't even get a minority status, even a minority status, right? But those who got the minority status, I mean, the Jew and the Greek and the Armenians, I mean, they couldn't even protect their rights. We know what happened to them right after Lausanne, and you know, in many situations during the Second World War. I mean, we don't have these people are almost gone, almost totally destroyed there. So the international community couldn't even, you know, assume its responsibilities, fulfill its roles and responsibilities when it comes to those things. Why? Because those matters also kind of, although they are a part of the international, you know, legal system, they should be. But over 100 years, all of these things, they became kind of domestic matters left to the mercy of a highly racist and authoritarian Turkish state, unfortunately. So in that sense, let me finish by saying, repeating that let's not talk about this as a peace treaty, but as a kind of building block, a historical building block that has set the conditions of contemporary suffering, pain, as well as political struggles of almost all non-Turkish peoples in this particular territory. Let me stop here, and then in the Q&A session, I would be happy to answer other questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hisyar Özsoy. Okay, with this, we can start the discussion. And who would like to start with the first question? You can, okay, we have a question from Dersim. Please, Dersim, go ahead.
Yes, my first question is to Nilay. Turkey, or voices in Turkish politics, has repeatedly stressed that the treaty will expire, probably in the hope of an empire, right? Or what do you think?
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I haven't yet talked to any experts working specifically on Lausanne, confirming that the treaty will be expired or there are like secret articles to it. This is mostly a domestic policy discourse that's not just with the current government. I mean, there has been a Lausanne issue, a Lausanne discourse in Turkey from around the 1930s, 40s onwards. Ultra-rightist discourses talked about Lausanne as a conspiracy and, criticized İsmet İnönü and the Turkish delegation for giving out the significant province of Mosul. So Lausanne has actually been a significant, source of this ultra-rightist populist legacy in Turkey. And the recent government really made good use of that to further build their populist bases, referring to the fact that Turkey now represents a new voice, a new almost anti-colonial voice to change this conspiracy that was imposed on Turkey 100 years ago. Neither myself nor other scholars are aware of any deadline put on, or any expiration date put on the Lausanne Treaty, nor secret agreements. In fact, apart from this, domestic policy discourse, there are a lot actually that concerns the Turkish history and Turkish politics in its, current shape, beyond its secret agreements or beyond its expiration dates. Like the Turkish state regularly organized military operations, cross-border military operations to negotiate the terms of Lausanne. So they're not just concerned about secret articles or its expiration date, but they are actually making good use of that for current political and military goals to change the borders that were, designated by the Lausanne Treaty. So it is like, yes, it is an important aspect of the current Turkish government's, especially the president's attempt to get followers, to render the Turkish government as the heroic voice against the colonial great power discourses. But as it is, it's not just a discursive issue. We know that it has like actual foreign policy implications to expand to the larger Middle East, to destroy the bases of Kurdish entity in Syria, in Rojava. So I find that more critical and more dangerous than the oldest populist discourse about like the expiration and then the secret treaties.
Thank you very much, Nilay. Dersim, do you have further question or?
No, not at the moment, but I'm very interested also in the comments of Hisyar to my question, because he smiled, and it's really something just to smile, but it's also a reality, as Nilay said. Not that the treaty is expired, but the political aspect.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I think I totally agree with Nilay. Totally agree with her in that this discourse was produced to be consumed by a lot of people before the elections this year, which was 100th anniversary. It's not just of Lausanne, it's also the Declaration of the Republic. It's 100th anniversary, the most, they said, important elections. Kind of the discourse was that like Turkey will destroy the chains put on it by the Lausanne Treaty. I mean, this is a totally baseless, ridiculous, stupid argument. But there are a lot of consumers of this argument, anyways. People truly believe that the Lausanne Treaty, and those people who believed in it, they didn't know what Lausanne is. They have never read it. But they just believe it's going to stop somewhere and things are going to be fine. Why? Because our president said so. And they believed in it. Honestly, it somehow worked. So that's part of a very populist, stupid right-wing discourse. But whether we like it or not, in Turkey, there is a lot of circulation and consumption of such ridiculous ideas. But Nilay is also definitely right in that Turkey has been actually undermining the terms, violating the terms of the Lausanne Treaty. Turkey is an occupying force in Iraq. Turkey is an occupying force in Syria. And both the Iraqi government and the Syrian government has asked Turkey to leave, but they are not leaving there. As if it has not been enough to destroy the Kurds, their political existence, their sovereignty, their right to almost anything, even their right to life. Now, and not now, but it has been over the last 30, 40 years, Turkey has been actively trying to occupy parts of Kurdistan in Iraq and in Syria to undermine the possibility of a kind of strong autonomous or federal Kurdish existence that may be internationally recognized. For now, they can't do much against the Kurds in Iraq because the status of the Kurds in Iraq, what we call Bashur, that status is internationally recognized when the Iraqi constitution was recognized by the international order, right? So the Kurds do have an international recognition thanks to the recognition of the new Iraq, the new constitution of Iraq. So Turkey has to deal with them. I mean, that's the harsh reality. But in the words of President Erdogan, Turkey would do whatever it could to prevent the formation of another, what they call Northern Iraq in Syria, which is another autonomous or federal region in Syria. I mean, they don't take it. That is why they're fighting. I mean, ultimately, it has been 100 years. The Kurds are fighting for some degree of international recognition of their sovereignty as a people, as a native people in the Middle East. They want to have some degree of autonomous political existence there in one form or another. It can be federal, it can be autonomous, it can be independent, it can be whatever, right? These things can be negotiated, but the desire and the struggle for that desire and demand is there, while the Turkish government, the Turkish establishment has been trying to destroy that, even violating the very Lausanne Treaty that they had signed and are so proud of. That is the other interesting thing, right? They are both proud of the Lausanne Treaty, and yet at the same time, they want to conquer other parts of Kurdistan. So we need to really focus. This should be a focus of our debates. I agree with Nilay in that sense.
I would like to actually add one more thing to what Hisyar said, because he pointed out how the any sort of autonomy or independence or any status for Kurds in the Middle East is a constant source of anxiety for not only the Turkish states, but other nation states in the region. And this also has a historical genealogy, which even within, in the processes leading up to the Lausanne, the discussions in the first parliament, when they were talking about, for example, the actions and then the independence claims of Sheikh Mahmoud Eberzanji, they were referring to the fact that if he gets any sort of autonomy or recognition or political status in the south, this will come all the way up to Turkish Eastern Anatolia. So that discourse also has a certain degree of continuity from the 1920s to the contemporary era. So this is like an ongoing concern and an ongoing, anxiety. And for about the other thing, Lausanne, whether it is a success or it's not a success, purely from the Turkish point of view, refers to the domestic conflicts within the Turkish political elites as well, because most of the time, rightist, ultra-rightist governments, they used it against the Republican regimes, the Republican elites, to make a point about, well, like you said, Hisyar, this is the form, the treaty that formed the state, but it also gave a lot of fuel for the inter-elite conflict within Turkey, especially in times of the rise of the ultra-rightist discourses.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Further questions? Nilay, you mentioned Hysar's perspective on the Lausanne Treaty, and you also said that we need a new perspective on the Lausanne Treaty, and his perspective turned somehow the view on Lausanne upside down. Can you explain a bit more what you mean by this?
Sure, absolutely. Hysar's perspective is a very important one to understand the types of regimes that came after the Lausanne Treaty. Like Hisyar mentioned, it didn't bring peace. It maybe brought peace at a limited military history perspective level, but beyond that, for the communities that posed the potential threat to the nation states, this was absolutely no peace. And Hysar actually talks about the significance of this for the regional history, European history, and for the history of the minority groups like Kurds and Armenians and others. But when I talk about how we change our historical perspective on the Kurds and Kurdish elites, it is kind of specifically about how we understand Kurdish history, how we approach Kurdish history within this larger regional political context. So most of the time, it's not just an issue that concerns our understanding of the Lausanne or the 20th century. When we look back and when we talk about the Kurdish past, we have this set notion of failure, right? Because we know that with the end of World War I and with the drawing of the new borders, Kurds did not receive any sort of recognition, right? We know that they had an active political context to demand things, But the end result was that Kurds didn't have any sort of political recognition, and Lausanne actually sealed the deal for that, right? It was the international recognition for a lack of Kurdish recognition. But as historians, being a historian is kind of difficult, because on the one hand, you know the end of the story, but on the other hand, you have to recognize the fact that past actors, right, historical agents, did not know that end result, right? This indicates a very common fallacy in historical thinking. On the one hand, we have to explain why actually Kurds didn't get recognition, why they failed to have a state while everyone else was getting one, most of them. But on the other hand, we have to do justice to the Kurdish elites or non-elites in terms of what options they had, what strategies they used, and what difficulties they faced, what their constraints were, right? And you will see that there is a lot of popular history or academic writing going on about Kurds within the context of the Treaty. But recent historians, there is like work by Jean Bajalan or others criticizing this failure perspective. It doesn't mean that we want to change the end result, but we want to do justice to the actions of the Kurdish elites. So one common pattern in these historical writings is the idea that Kurdish elites were fragmented, right? They were fragmented, there was a lot of inter-elite conflicts, and they were unable to form a unity. But when you look more closely, well, a lot of elite groups in the Middle East, in Greater Syria, in Iraq, Arab or Turkish or other ethnic groups, they did not in and of itself form a coherent unity. They did not form legitimacy in face of, like before their constituencies automatically. Most of the time, when we think of the Kurdish elites, we are juxtaposing it to successful state-making projects like Turkey or others like the post-mandate regimes like Iraq or Syria. They all ended up having states. But one thing that we truly underestimate in this assessment is the fact that, well, if we take the Turkish state as an example, because like we juxtapose it with Mustafa Kemal, Kuvayi Milliye, National Independence Movement, for one thing, they were not any less fragmented, right? Because when we look more closely into the early Republican Turkish history, Mustafa Kemal or the National Independence Movement, they did not have legitimacy or legitimate representation automatically. They, day by day, worked on it by suppressing the opposition, suppressing alternative discourses, and changing their strategies on the way. That's one thing. But the second thing that we really have to take really seriously is that Turkish nationalist movement took over not only the state tradition, but the state capacity of the Ottoman state. Meaning, well, we know that at some point there were two governments, Istanbul government and Ankara government. Well, there were conflicts between them. But when the Kurdish nationalist movement, even at its crawling phase with its baby steps, Mustafa Kemal and a significant group of the national elites, these cadres, they took over, they inherited the military, economic, and political institutions of the Ottoman imperial system. So when we talk about the Kurdish elites, that's where the historical injustice comes from. When we talk about their past, they didn't have that, right? They did not have that. They were a part of an imperial context, and they were literally operating in a land of absences in terms of what state capacity is. So in that respect, I would say that Kurds and Armenians are unique, not unique, but we have to recognize the specific constraints that they face, because in the other parts of the post-Ottoman world, like the Arab world specifically, we know that they took over, when they became independent, they took over the colonial state structures in the 1940s and 1950s. So that is one thing. And then the other thing is this question of fragmentedness, being fragmented, that I mentioned at the beginning. But when I read the testimonies, memoirs, right? The documents from different governmental archives. Yes, there was a degree of fragmentedness at the ideological level, which we should really expect, because nation building is not, it doesn't come automatically, right? Every nation building process comes in a land of ideological plurality, if that makes sense. And then there's one group that they emerge and establish a certain degree of authority and hegemony, and then they use the state structures, military force, ideological doctrination to create the illusion that hegemony was always there, right? That's what happened with the Turkish state and other states. But for the Kurds, that didn't happen because they never had that state. They never had that institutional capacity, state capacity to build that discourse. So for Kurds who are talking about their past right now, and those who are sympathetic to the Kurdish cause in our contemporary era, now it's the time that we should stop reproducing this colonial ahistorical perspective. Because when you read accounts of other examples, like elites in Greater Syria, elites in Iraq, right? And elites in other parts of the post-Ottoman lands, they are ideologically fragmented, and we should expect them to be ideologically fragmented. You know why? Because they lived under the Ottoman realm in an imperial context for 3 centuries. And by the time the war brought the end of the empire, Kurdish elites, just like the Turkish elites, were imperial subjects. What imperial means is something kind of different from what we understand from national. Imperial means like multi-centeredness. There are like multiple cities, provincial centers from where elites operate. They have different cultural backgrounds, right? They might have different political imaginaries that are shaped by their cultural background, ideological affinity, religious background, their position with respect to the imperial entity, the caliphate, the royalty. So that diversity or fragmentedness, or let me put it this way, that diversity does not necessarily mean fragmentedness. We explain this as fragmentedness only because we know the end of the story as a failure, right? But this was only normal for Kurdish elites who were still operating in an imperial context to have different ideologies, different strategies, and different tactics. And when we actually look closely, the simplest example here would be the Kurdistan Teali Cemiyeti, like the Society for the Advancement of Kurdistan, established in the aftermath of World War I, which became the home for a lot of Kurdish elites to voice their demands for political recognition, right? And there's like different discourses for autonomy, for instance, an autonomy within the Ottoman imperial structure, or full independence like the Bedr Khan's family voiced frequently. But despite these differences, when you look more closely into this time period, what I see is that despite ideological diversity, despite intra-elite conflicts, which is not unique to the Kurdish elites, there is a notion of a shared dream of recognition for Kurds. And that is actually at the core of any nationalist project. Once you have that, everything else is circumstantial, meaning it depends on institutional capacity, it depends on international context, right? And the international context was, other historians also emphasize that, not that welcoming for the Kurdish elites for their recognition of their rights. I mean, I can keep going on and on about this, like how we can actually turn upside down this problematic essentialist and Orientalist perspective towards the Kurdish elites and their movements in the processes leading up to the Lausanne Treaty.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. This really gives an interesting perspective.
Ahmed, can I add something jumping here?
Yes, please.
I think, reading history in an anachronic way has been a key success of Kurdish politicians, I should say. That is what you do. you read history in a wrong way. That's how you do politics mostly. But I want to also say that the argument that, because, I mean, this is how you justify yourself, right? I mean, the Kurds failed at the end of the so-called War of Independence because they were not unified, they were fragmented, ideologically, politically, they were not sufficiently nationalist, they were like still like Muslim, and their Islamic identity was still very much foregrounded. Their nationalist identity was not that strong, blah, blah. These are some of the arguments that, you know, we know, arguments presented to us as historical narratives. But I think, while I agree with, of course, Nilay's interpretation, that most of these are both anachronic and decontextualized, that they do not read really the specific historical context. They are more actor-oriented, disregarding any kind of institutional, structural, or external barriers, constraints in which those actors are operating. And the fact that actually, I mean, the Arab people have, I think, 22 countries. I mean, they are all over the place. They are so fragmented and disjointed and disunited. I mean, come on. I mean, it's not, state making is not about being just, you know, unite. First you get united and then you have your state. It never worked like that. Even the French, like when France was declared as an independent country, I think only 3% of the population spoke proper French, only 3%. So it's not about that, but this kind of self-orientalizing that, you know, we failed because we are bad, kind of like we are fragmented, disunited, we can never come together. I mean, that's really, I mean, one needs to, I mean, correct kind of like the historical scales of justice there. I totally agree with Nilay, but then I think this argument by political elites, contemporary political, like Kurdish politicians or political organizations, the constant talk about the fragmentation of previous Kurdish leaderships or movements speaks to, I would say, speaks less about the past, what happened in the past, but more about the contemporary situation, I think. So in that sense, it's also kind of a misplacement or displacement again. I mean, that's how you read. I mean, in an anachronic way, when you read history anachronically, I mean, it's not about the fragmentation of them in the past, but the need for actual national unity at this most crucial time. So when people talk about the past, they almost always talk about the present situation. So it's kind of a projection oftentimes. So in that sense, where I'm not a historian, but I did some cultural history of the Sheikh Said and his missing grave. I wrote something in the past. And while writing that, I realized that when people talk about the Sheikh Said, his rebellion and his, you know, struggle and suffering, they are less talking about what happened in the past. They are more talking about the contemporary situation. So in that sense, I think, while I totally agree with Nilay in the sense that, like, this is a misinterpretation of history, but why, although we know that this is a misinterpretation, but still it is such a powerful discourse, right? And I think that speaks to the contemporary situation and our need, by our I mean the Kurdish need for some kind of a national, even if not unity or not consensus, but somehow political forces, somehow at the cultural level, symbolic level, political level, diplomatic level, somehow exchanging ideas and trying to come together in an effort to find kind of a place for the Kurds in the international order at a time when the kind of like the region, the Middle East, is being dislocated by sweeping transformations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, since we started to maybe create a new perspective on the Lausanne Treaty and on that time, I mean, we said, okay, many nations received their states, but the Kurds were ignored, and some interpretations are that we were too fragmented, we were not united, and so on. But let me ask you this. I mean, could it be also the case that the call for Kurdish independence within the Kurdish society at that time maybe was not that strong. Okay, we know the Bedrkhanis, who for sure wanted independence, but maybe most of the Kurds that time dreamed or wanted an existence within one state with the Turks, as for instance also as a maybe as a continuation of their existence within the Ottoman Empire. So maybe can the speakers maybe talk about this a bit? So was there really a very strong will for independence, and the global powers didn't give us a state, and we were ignored by them? Is this the whole story, or was it also that maybe the will for independence was not that strong within the Kurdish society? So, and maybe it's because, as Hisyar said, maybe we are projecting this situation of today to that time. Nowadays, maybe the will or the call for independence is stronger, and we look at that time from today's perspective.
Should I?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
She is the historian. I mean, she needs to speak first. She knows the historical facts, so I just to interpret.
So, well, this is, of course, a legitimate question, right? Did the Kurds really want an independent state, or did they not want one? But I think, like, when we pose the question in this way, we get like a very schematic understanding of the political positions at the time. We either look for a full-fledged, unified, coherent search for a nation state. And when we don't find that, we are puzzled and we think that there was not that desire coming from the Kurdish. But like, it's not just for the Kurdish elites, but really I have to overemphasize this time period. I would describe this from around 1914 until 1925, since we are talking about Lausanne. Things were really, as far as political projects are concerned, were less, straightforward or more ambiguous for political actors coming from different backgrounds. What I mean by this is, in fact, it's very puzzling when you read the actions, ideologies, agendas of Kurdish elites in this very short time period. You will see that there are times in which they want, for instance, they think that it is okay to have like an autonomous area under the British mandate. Even there are discourses about like a potential American mandate. So, and we also know that when Sherif Pasha went to the Paris Peace Conference, he talked about like a potential Armenian and Kurdish state next to one another, which created a lot of, reactions from certain elite groups in the region. But the idea here is that the point that I really want to emphasize here is that Kurds were aware of the fact that Kurdish elites were aware of the fact that political borders were being redrawn, imperial era had come to an end, and a political recognition in any form by the international community was an existential question. So this is the bare minimum that I think we should be looking at. But the actual contours of what type of recognition varied, okay? It was circumstantial, it was contextual, it was a matter of ability, it was a matter of diplomacy, because even when you read the British approach, for instance, to a potential independent Kurdish state, that also changes in 3 years from like in so drastic ways that it's hard to pinpoint British policy in a straightforward manner. So that sort of ambiguity is the rule. It was the rule as opposed to the exception. But having said that, we really have to keep this in mind that Kurds did understand the significance of being recognized as a political force and territorial designation. And to give you a couple of examples here, for instance, we know that some of the Kurdish MPs in the Turkish parliament, right, before 1923, they were vehemently opposed to the idea that Mosul would be under the British control. So they forced this. They were arguing that Mosul has to be a part of the Turkish mainland. But this wasn't just to protect the territorial unity of the future Turkish state, but they thought that negotiating with Turkey over any sort of recognition or autonomy would be easier, right? And that was one reason strategically. Secondly, they were thinking like, because when we look at the British plans, British schemes, of course, their schemes were focused mostly on Bashur as opposed to Bakur. And that is like, you know, a lot of strategic reasons in terms of how the colonial British Empire was formed, their priorities, so on and so forth. But when we look at their schemes, they at some point were clear that they wanted to separate southern Kurdistan from northern Kurdistan. And that's like all of their policies were towards that separation. And the Kurdish elites were very much concerned about that in their in their dealings with the British, in their dealings with the Turkish elites, or in their internal conversation. They almost always emphasize that we want a unified Kurdistan. We don't want Kurdistan to be divided. We don't want the south to be separated from the north. But when you look at the very same problem in a couple of years, in a year, in less than a year, we see that their situation, their position on the undividedness of historic Kurdistan would change, because they recognized that there was not an, welcoming international community to support that goal. On top of that, going back to your original question, Ahmet, if they wanted an independent Kurdistan, there is, of course, other things. One thing that's really factored in strongly in their considerations of the possibility of an independent Kurdistan was, of course, the Armenian issue, because the Armenians and Kurds, right, they are the indigenous populations of the area, but we know that from around the 1890s there was like the massacres and then the Kurdish role in the genocidal context. But coming to the processes leading up to the Lausanne, both groups are looking for any type of political recognized territoriality in the region, right? And we know that, and we have studies, not new studies, so like Lan Agnek Jolu's work now looks at how and why Armenians asked for an Armenian homeland at the Lausanne conference, right? There is also that parameter. But the period from around 1919, when the Greek occupation or Greek war with the Turks started, until 1922, the Kemalist elites really pitted Muslim and Christian groups against each other by creating or feeding into this fear that historic Kurdistan would be taken away and given to a potential Armenian state by the great powers. So that fear was really maintained alive with like strong propaganda and strong indoctrination. And it wasn't just like propaganda, right? Kurds have their own history in terms of the Armenian past. So they have their own conflicts, they have their own violent encounters in the past, and then of course the genocidal process. So for the Kurds, the potential loss of the Kurdish territory to a potential Armenian homeland was one of the factors which changed their strategies from 1919 to 1923 to turn their faces more closely towards the Turkish nationalist elites. So there is also that parameter, because we know, for instance, when the Greek fire happened, like the Izmir fire happened, Smyrna fire happened, that created like an outrage in the Kurdish cities. So there was fear, for a good reason or not, that's something that we have to look more closely, like the opinion, how people felt about it, why were they so scared about it. That also created a certain degree of, well, Turkish state will be the best choice. That's our best bet, because we're not getting anything from the British. The British is the key actor drawing the borders in the region. So it has to be taken seriously. And since by 1922, it was clear that Sèvres Treaty had become null and void, the Kurds wouldn't have gotten any type of recognition from the international community, and the British wouldn't have supported them. Coupled with what is happening in Anatolia at the time, and the history of fights in the region, and the potential idea of an Armenian state in the region, that fear that created among the Kurdish population, specifically the Kurdish elites, all of these need to be taken into account to understand what happened at the end, like why some of the Kurdish elites thought that the potential Turkish state would be maybe the optimum choice for political recognition. But I want to emphasize one more thing here. Most of the time, well, I'm a social historian, right? Like I don't think history can be written and understood only through the actions of the elites. So we have to understand, and your question actually nicely alluded to that, like you talked about the Kurdish population and their responses and their expectations. When we look at the Kurdish population, for one thing, historiography is in a dismal shape, in the sense that when we think of Kurdish history, what we think of is exclusively, entirely Kurdish elite history, okay? And two, as far as the specific discussion on the Lausanne is concerned, the approach to the Kurdish, ordinary sections of the Kurdish society, let me put it that way, is equally essentialist, equally self-orientalizing, and unfair. Unfair because there is this notion that, right, an idea that we reproduce, recirculate constantly. Kurdish elites were the followers of Kurdish popular classes, they just follow their elites. They didn't have political agency. They were they respected the Turkish, Ottoman Caliphate. They were actually driven by their tribal or religious, quote unquote, primordial allegiances. So this is the conventional standard narrative about the Kurdish elites. But this is really unfair, because it is unfair because we have to first, well, we need more historians interested in understanding the social history of Kurdistan and Kurds. But two, when we look at Kurdistan had been a war geography since the late 19th century, right? Kurdistan had great ecological, social, and economic destruction with the war, with the Great War, World War I. And in the 1920s, right around these peace process itself, famine was a big issue in Kurdistan. We never talk about that. Famine was a big issue. Like when you read the records from the British and other testimonies, we see that people are hungry, right? Famine is a big problem, and the geography is destroyed. And we oftentimes talk about colonialism of Kurdistan, specifically referring to the territorial divisions, right? The drawing of the borders. But colonization did not start with Lausanne. Colonization of Kurdistan did not start with the Turkish Republic. If you look at colonization as a social, economic, and cultural process, we have to go further back in time. I'm not saying this because I'm an Ottoman historian, but if you really want to understand what resource extraction, what economic exploitation did to Kurdistan, we have to go back at least 2 centuries in time, okay? So that's why historical perspectives that portray the Kurdish ordinary classes as ordinary groups as, oh, they were followers of their elites, they did not support an independence project, they did not know anything about the national identity, they were all driven by their primordial identities. These are so unfair. This is like a condescending view of the Kurdish population. And well, like Hisyar said, this also has ramifications for the present, how we look at the popular classes as well. So it is really important. Well, I really have to emphasize this. When it comes to Kurdish scholarship, there is a lot of work being done by people who are devoted, dedicated. They want to understand Kurdish past in a fair, in an honest way. But most of the time, the questions that we ask and the answers that we give are derived from our contemporary concerns, right? I mean, that is understandable. Historical professions, somehow we do this. But we have to go beyond that a little bit to understand, to do justice to the experiences of the Kurdish people in such a key time period in the 20th century, right? It's a war-torn area, right? We don't talk about conscription of the larger Kurdish population. We don't talk about what conscription did to Kurdish households in this context. We talk about the Kurdish revolts, Kurdish uprisings to basically highlight the resistance of the Kurdish people. But we don't talk about what's happening to the larger segments of the society as these uprisings were happening. What happens to agriculture? What happens to their everyday practices? So these are questions that have to be explored seriously so that we won't have that really condescending approach of Kurdish past and the Kurdish popular classes and the elites for that matter.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hisyar, would you like to add something?
I agree here. I agree with Nilay. No, I mean, honestly, you see, I think this debate, I'm no longer an academic. I have left academia like 8 years ago when I joined politics, but seeing these kinds of debates are happening now, and I think they should happen. And there is a vast Kurdish studies kind of space there now. But these are very, very key fundamental questions. These are the key narratives or tropes with which we read history, like this whole thing about fragmentation and blah, blah. And I think I don't know whether it happened before, but it would be something very fantastic to actually put together a conference, really, specifically to talk about some of these issues that, Nilay highlighted, like, really, what is this thing about the fragmentation and national unity? I mean, it's always talked about, but really we never attend to its historical specificity. It is always a kind of talk there and some narrative. We keep repeating the same cliche, but we never attend to the historical detail, fact there. Of course, it is difficult, to get to these kinds of details. That is something that the profession should think. What kind of methods? But I have been learning something today. This thing this conversation we are having, it was very enlightening for me. I am not alien to these kinds of questions, but as we speak, I'm seeing actually the kind of limitations that somehow constrain our historical imagination and consequently our political imagination, right? Like for probably 50 years or so, the Kurdish elites or politicians or whatever, however you call them, they called, for example, Idrisi Bitlisi a traitor, right? This was some key historical narrative, like he is a traitor, he is not sufficiently nationalistic, he destroyed the Kurds, betrayed the Kurds, blah, blah. And then things change, and when the Kurdish movement starts negotiating with the Turkish establishment for a kind of negotiated peace, all of a sudden we see Idrisi Bitlisi becomes kind of a very smart, intelligent guy trying to kind of make bridges between Turks and Kurds in the Ottoman era, which is another totally misleading historical interpretation. No problem about that. We don't expect politicians to, be historians. And if they become, I don't know, probably they won't be good politicians anyway, because you need to do misinterpretation, you need to do all kinds of things, rhetoric to somehow make something. But even a name like Idrisi Bitlisi was, such a powerful reaction from all Kurdish nationalists. And then when you no longer seek, say, national independence, or when you want to actually create bridges between the Turkish people, then you somehow foreground that figure as a model actually to follow in the present, right? And I remember in the early 2000s, even in the writings of Abdullah Öcalan and others, there were actually debates about, like, you know, maybe we should reread history, maybe like just totally kind of like from a strictly nationalistic perspective, like maybe that wasn't the case, because there were times, as Nilay is saying, and this is nothing to be ashamed of, to say that a lot of Kurdish people try to find a way to coexist with other Muslim communities, I mean, in the area. And why? I mean, this is quite a rational choice. It can be made. Some made that choice. But now, after 100 years, so we look at history and we say, oh, this was right, this was wrong from our, you know, unique political perspective. So I think Nilay would be very good. And I would be, I mean, if you still count me as an academic, I would be very happy to contribute to kind of a debate about this, like this whole thing about the Kurds are fragmented and it's all our fault, it's our failure, we couldn't do this, we couldn't do that, as if all others actually, they were totally united. And, you know, just one last example, when in 2003, when America occupied Iraq, at the time, the official formal demand of the Kurdish people and Kurdish leaders in Iraq was cultural autonomy. You know that? So they weren't even demanding political autonomy, but cultural autonomy. And then something happened and they almost got an almost independent state. You see, it was a confederal, the right to even have a referendum for independence, blah, blah. So, I mean, it is, but when that happened, the Kurds were totally disunited. Still, they are so much disunited. They couldn't join their Peshmerga forces. They couldn't join the education system. They couldn't do this. They couldn't do that. So in that sense, I mean, of course, I mean, to what extent as a people you are prepared for some kind of political recognition? This is Kurdish politicians, movements, organizations, they should think about it. But more kind of unity, more integration, more kind of work there, of course, it's going to make things a bit easy. I'm not against that, of course. If you call it a homework, a lot of homework should be done in that context. But mostly, really, when you look at the Balkans, the Middle East, and in Africa, in all of these places, independence or independent states did not emerge because a lot of people were just doing the right thing at the right time. I mean, mostly there was some kind of cartographic and engineering of those geographies and those, you know, peoples, and divide, cut, draw boundaries and borders, big powers and things like that. So in that sense, very fascinating, actually, Nilay, the notion of ambiguity, transition, and, you know, this whole discourses of fragmentation, which are actually key tropes to read Kurdish history. I know there have been a lot of debates on deconstructing Kurdish history and historiography, but I haven't encountered a debate specifically about these kinds of issues. And I think it's very timely to pursue something like that. And I would be happy to contribute in any way I can.
I actually have good news for you, because we are organizing a conference at Yale next year in 2024. With colleagues like Mahshub Kurt and Jonathan Wirtson, and the conference would be the long 20th century of Kurds, where we will be discussing these things, kind of experimenting in new historical perspectives. So we would be happy to have you contribute as well.
Okay, keep me in the loop. So
of course,
we'll talk. Thank you.
It also sounds very interesting to me, and I also found the discussion here very inspiring, and maybe as Kurd-Akad we can also organize more events about rereading the Kurdish history from a different perspective. Yeah, it's very interesting. If there are any further questions, we can maybe take one question. If not, we can slowly come to an end. Are there any further questions? Okay, if not, then thank you very much to both speakers. If you would like to have, to say some final words, please, some closing statements, or yeah, maybe how should we go forward from here, I mean,
Yeah, I
we
mean,
we looked to the past, to the history,
Mhm.
but if we look forward, what is the meaning of Lausanne for us? Or yeah, how should we go forward from here?
Mhm.
Maybe very, very briefly.
Well, that is a question I think I would pass to Hisyar about the larger political context and the actual political processes. But as the final remarks, I think I can mention the fact that, well, our questions that we ask of the past should come from the present, right? Because this is what we are trying to interpret. This is what we are trying to understand. And especially for Kurds, these are existential issues, right? Understanding why Kurds didn't have a state is an existential question, because the Kurdish presence, Kurdish political presence is threatened by so many directions and so many actors in our contemporary era. However, our answers to these questions can't come from the present. I think this is what I would like to highlight here. The questions should come from or can from the present, but we have to maintain a more nuanced understanding of the past to do justice to the history of our own people. That's one thing. And secondly, I am this happened actually during the discussions on World War I, right? 2014 was the centenary of the beginning of World War I, and the academic community in Europe and in North America had several events about this, right? World War I, and there's tons of publications. But you wouldn't be surprised when I said that Kurds did remain on the margins of that scholarship. Kurds are and still are at the center of the political processes and the historical processes that produce the Middle East. But when it comes to the historical examination, they are always marginalized. And that is something about the way Middle Eastern studies and the scholarship is built. So that's why we have to work on opening space for the understanding of academic scholarship of the Kurdish past. And the second thing is for my really young colleagues working on Kurdish history, I hope they will have more interest in understanding Kurdish past beyond the level of elite politics to do justice to the larger segments of the society. It is more difficult. It is more laborious. It definitely is more difficult. But I am really expecting that we will see more works using oral sources to understand, really what was the impact of the war on the Kurdish society. And as far as the Lausanne is concerned, as Hisyar mentioned, this was not a peace. This was a peace only at the military conflict level and the international context. But beyond that, for the stateless communities, particularly for Kurds, this started a period of racialization and state building in a racialized manner. Despite all of these, though, we know that in the 1930s, Kurdish nationalist movement had a clear agenda with the Azadi and all. This was built on the efforts of the Kurdish elites before the Lausanne process. So that did not come out of the blue, but the activities of the process, the elites before the Lausanne, paved the way for the emergence of this Kurdishness as a political identity. And thank you again for inviting me today.
Thank you very much, Nilay. Hisyar, if you would like
thank
to.
you. Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you so much. I mean, maybe very shortly, I mean, the fight for sovereignty, for recognition, the Kurdish fight for it is continuing, I mean, in all parts of Kurdistan. And in Rojava, we know the processes in Iraqi Kurdistan, in northern Kurdistan, in Rojhelat. I mean, the Kurds are really trying to kind of carve up an autonomous space for themselves in a geography where for 100 years they simply did not exist. I mean, in the international legal sense of the term. And of course, in southern Kurdistan, things are a bit different, but there are multiple challenges there. In Rojava, we all know the process, and in the north, we are having a lot of issues and problems, and there's an ongoing struggle, and there was a recent defeat in the elections, and President Erdogan is there, which is, I would say, this is circumstantial. I mean, it's going to come and pass, but struggle goes on, and we're regrouping and repositioning. And in Rojava, oftentimes when we talk about these issues, Rojava is some like on the side, although like the movement, Azadi, the whole thing, for a year. So, I mean, and that is I agree with Nilay in that I think this is what Howard Zinn once said. I mean, historians, particularly critical and opposition historians, love to tell stories of heroic resistance and defeat, but almost always defeat and failure and defeat and failure. And he says that actually this is kind of surrendering to the hegemonic discourse. I mean, sometimes we should be also telling stories of like victory, even if small and limited. And, I mean, otherwise, I mean, it has been 100 years and the Kurds are still, I mean, in all parts of Kurdistan, they are quite alive, they are quite robust, and they are maintaining their political struggle. They did not assimilate, they did not, I mean, there were fights and there were like suffering and death and killing, and it's going on, but there is also like a very difficult but dignified struggle ongoing. And now the whole region is being redesigned again. I mean, we are seeing what happened in Iraq and Syria and whatnot. And I think at this most critical moment, we need to have the right debates about our past as a people. And I don't like the idea of, we learn from the past. I mean, that is a classical thing. There's another kind of cliche that we always have, right? I mean, like learn from the past and, do the future kind of thing. I don't know. But there are all these conflicts, debates, missed opportunities in the past, but potentialities in the future. And I think it is history in the making, and we are all both objects and subjects, actors of this history in the making. It's a process. So lovely debate. Thank you so much. And I hope in the future, both politically and also intellectually, we can engage some of the issues that we have somehow underlined here. Lovely. Thank you for allowing me to join this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I find this debate very, very interesting, and I think our participants felt the same. And yeah, with this, we close our meeting. Thank you very much for joining, and see you next time in one of the next.
Okay. By the way,
events.
before, okay, can you stop there, Sim, the YouTube one? And so I have 2 friends. I want to say hi on a personal level. Mithat, merhaba.
Yes.